already liberalizing under Gorbachev, and Lithuania's efforts might have had a different outcome under Stalin. But that's only to say that the success of any effort depends upon the conditions under which it's undertaken. This is true of violent efforts to change the world as well. To the extent that they work, it's always because the conditions existing at the time they were undertaken. Hypothesize radically different conditions, and it's easy to conceptualize a situation in which violent methods would work. Now, on this question of whether nonviolence can work, we should, of course, look back to history and see the case of Christianity. Christianity began as a nonviolent religion. Although Jesus didn't speak directly to issues of war and nonviolence, his early followers understood his teachings to counsel nonviolence, and Christians for the first several centuries after his death were pacifistic, despite severe persecution by the Romans. It wasn't until the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, and more particularly St. Augustine in the 5th century, that Christianity embraced warfare and embarked upon the course it has followed until the present day. So if we're considering whether or not nonviolence can work, we need to look at examples in which indeed it has worked in the 20th century and historically as well. Finally, we need to reconceptualize the whole idea of security and to find ways of measuring it other than in terms of capacity to inflict death and destruction upon others. Stripped to its essentials, that's what military power is. And a nation can excel in that capacity, that is military power, even while thousands of its civilians toil in poverty or are deprived of basic human rights. Security becomes a perverse notion if people live under conditions of oppression that are worse than those their military power would protect them from. And it's doubly perverse if a major cause of their oppression is the diversion of society's resources to the maintenance of the military. Now, of these 5 points that I've mentioned, the first 3, that is, putting an end to demonizing people, seeing and calling by name the examples of nonviolence in the world, and rethinking our attachment to collectivities, those 3 are undoubtedly the easiest, at least in principle. They call mostly for revisions of our thinking. The 4th and the 5th, that is, finding ways to build upon the successes of nonviolence and implementing a new conception of security, are more difficult. But they're closely related, and I'd like primarily to discuss the 5th, that is, pertaining to the notion of security, since it's linked to the conception of power. Now, the advocates of a strong military are right, I think, to see that security rests upon power, and they're right that such power must be evident to potential aggressors. What I would ask you to consider, however, is that they're mistaken in their conception of what sort of power best provides security. And this requires that we rethink the notion of power itself. Now, consider military power. Armies are hierarchical, authoritarian institutions. Power resides at the top with the generals or with government leaders. The individual soldier has virtually none. Yet, paradoxically, the killing and dying associated with the use of military power is almost exclusively done by those with the least power. Hitler probably never personally killed a single human being, unless it was as a soldier in World War I. All of the killing at the hands of the German nation, from the battlefield to the extermination camps, was done by others. Whether in a democracy or a dictatorship, military power presupposes, and presupposes absolutely, the obedience of thousands and sometimes millions of persons to the will of a few, sometimes only one. Remove that obedience, and that power vanishes. And if that military power is overcome by another nation's superior military power, then the nation that relied upon that power is a vanquished nation. Its people had placed their security in the hands of the military. They had asked others, one could say they had forced others, since most nations conscript young people for their armies, to do their fighting and killing for them. Once they are defeated, that is, the young people they send out to fight and kill, then the country is defeated. The very mechanism intended to ensure security, namely the development of the capacity for organized, institutionalized violence, is, strange as it may seem, disempowering to those who rely upon it. Place all your hopes in the capacity of others to do your fighting for you, and you're left defenseless if and when they are defeated. By the same token, if we hypothesize that a country is invaded by another that wants to rule over it, we can readily see that to do that requires the acquiescence and the cooperation of the conquered people. This is true of large countries and so forth. Thoroughgoing and systematic non-cooperation can make it virtually impossible to govern a country. And it can make it even more evidently impossible when the country is a large one and the occupiers relatively few in number. Tolstoy, in his letter to a Hindu written in response to C.R. Das, who favored the violent overthrow of British rule in India, put it thusly. He was writing in 1908, near the end of his life, saying, whether the oppressors and oppressed are of one race, or whether, as in India and elsewhere, the oppressors are of a different nation. This phenomenon, Tolstoy continues, seems particularly strange in India, for there more than 200 million people, highly gifted both physically and mentally, most of that is, a commercial company enslaved a nation comprising 200 million. What does it mean that 30,000 men, the British, rather weak and ordinary people, have subdued 200 million vigorous, clever, capable, and freedom-loving people? Do not the figures make it clear that it's not the English who have enslaved the Indians, but the Indians who have enslaved themselves? Now Gandhi, who was greatly influenced by this letter of Tolstoy's, which he read when he was still in South Africa, was to say later that just as it's a sin to be an oppressor, so it's a sin to acquiesce in oppression. The message both Tolstoy and Gandhi, of Tolstoy and Gandhi in this regard, is that there's an enormous latent power within a people. That potential power needs violence for defense. To be sure, people imagine that they have power and security when they have a strong military, but they stake everything upon others, not upon themselves. I should say personally, I lived in the United States throughout the duration of the nuclear age, and I haven't for one moment felt more secure because of U.S. possession of nuclear weapons. In fact, I considered emigrating from the United States many years ago for the sake of my children. I didn't do it for various reasons, but it's a personal observation on the relation of force to security. The implications of this message are strong, and they go against the grain of much of common thinking, which invades against so-called blaming the victim. But the message here is that the oppressed are often complicit in their own oppression, and it's because the ways of thinking represented by the institutions they've relied upon for their security have disempowered them. This understanding of the latent power among people provides the basis for the analyses of Gene Sharp of the Albert Einstein Institute at Harvard, the leading figure in what I call pragmatic as opposed to principled nonviolence. His argument for nonviolence isn't based on moral or pacifistic grounds, but simply on the grounds that it's more effective. As hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets of Eastern European countries in acts of spontaneous nonviolence as the Soviet Union collapsed, the power of government after government virtually evaporated. Sharp contends that accordingly, the power of a collective nonviolent defense, deliberately and systematically practiced by a trained and disciplined population, is a far better way to defend a country than by military means. Whether that's true, and if it's true, to what extent it's true, remains to be seen, of course. We have countless examples of countries trying to maintain security through violence. Psychology, environmentalism, and ethics must be engaged in this process. Now, is this visionary? Some will ask, people aren't willing to put forth the effort and make this sacrifice. Well, I would reply that people already do put forth such an effort, and they do make such sacrifice, but they do it in the service of violent defense. And they do so collectively by channeling profits to those who design and manufacture weaponry, and then placing the primary burden of sacrifice upon young men, and occasionally women, whom they force, upon pain of fine or imprisonment, to do the killing and dying for them. Gandhi put it bluntly. He said, "The coward desires revenge, but being afraid to die, he looks to others, maybe the government of the day, to do the work of defense for him." Now, this is true of the coward, but more tellingly, it's also true of the vast majority of ordinary people, who, I would say, act not so much from cowardice as from inertia. The older established members of society have customarily placed the burden of defense upon their children, and do so in most nations of the world today. If the commodification of children, the United States, for example, it doesn't have a draft right at the moment, but it has a selective service system all in place, so that if there is a major conflict in a matter of days, young people will receive their draft notices and have to report to the military. A country like the United States singles out its young who had yet had little of their lives to lead, and who have spent most of those lives in childhood with little or no voice in government, and scarcely an opportunity to understand the complex issues over which nations go to war. It singles them out to defend the country. Wrapped in the flag and with millions of dollars to spend on propaganda and slick television commercials, the government, with the complicity of the overwhelming majority of the citizenry, manipulate their young into becoming trained killers. And make no mistake, military training, whatever else it may be, and whatever other ends it may serve, is first and foremost training to be an efficient and obedient killer. Virtually everyone in the military either is responsible for doing the killing or for helping in various ways to support those who do the killing. Virtually every soldier either prepares to engage in such killing himself or trains and supports those who do. As Gwynne Dyer has written recently, and I quote, "The armed forces of every country can take almost any young male civilian and turn him into a soldier with all the right reflexes and attitudes in only a few weeks. Their recruits usually have no more than 20 years of experience of the world, most of it as children, while the armies have had all of history to practice and perfect their techniques." Now, psychologist David Grossman has argued recently that there's an innate reluctance in persons to kill their fellow human beings, and that this is supported by evidence from combat. He reports that following the Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War, more than 27,000 muskets were found on the battlefield. And quite extraordinarily, of these, nearly 90% of them were loaded. So after the battle was over and they collected the guns from the battlefield, more than 27,000 rifles and more than 90% of them were loaded. And then, of those, 12,000 of those loaded muskets were found to be loaded more than once. And 6,000 of the multiply loaded weapons had from 3 to 10 rounds loaded in them. Well, what evidently had happened was that rather than firing their rifles, the soldiers would apparently appear to be firing, and then they would reload their rifles, and with the old muskets, you would put in some powder, and then you drop in the ball. And what they would do, they put in more powder, drop in another ball, and tamp it. But they weren't firing their rifles. 90% of the rifles were loaded, and a large percentage of those had been loaded more than once. This is David Grossman, psychologist, talking, and he also cites data suggesting that 80 to 85% of American World War II soldiers didn't fire their weapons in combat. Why then, asks Grossman, were so many loaded weapons available on the battlefield at Gettysburg, and why did at least 12,000 soldiers misload their weapons in combat? And then he answers his own question. He says, secretly, quietly, at the moment of decision, just like the 80 to 85% of World War II soldiers observed by Marshall, that's another study that he cites. He says, these soldiers at Gettysburg found themselves to be conscientious objectives who were unable to kill their fellow men. Now, these aren't the far-fetched claims of a biased pacifist trying to stack the decks against war. Grossman was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and Marshall, whose other data he cites, was a brigadier general. And Grossman unequivocally holds that he believes that war nonetheless is justified. Now, these conclusions are controversial to be sure, and more research, and particularly cross-cultural research, would be needed to establish convincingly whether they're true. But their truth or falsity bears only upon the question of how much of human nature the militaries of the world must overcome to turn young people into trained killers. It doesn't alter the fact that that is what the military does. My point is that a nation like the United States has only the form of democracy, not its full content. No country enjoys a fully free and democratic society so long as it treats its most valuable resource, its children, in such a way, by seducing them into the military life in peacetime and forcing them into involuntary servitude in times of crisis. And that's what military draft is. It's involuntary servitude. There's no greater measure of the integrity of a society than the way it treats its children. This, I would add, gives added import to the Nobel Peace Prize laureates' call for a decade of nonviolence for the children of the world. Through nonviolence, the adults of society can lift such a burden from the heads of their children and take unto themselves the primary burden of preserving what they value most in that society. Not that there may not be a role for children in nonviolence as well, but if distributed justice is to be a property of a free and democratic society, then it must govern the relative distribution of burdens between adults and young people in that society. Military defense doesn't, and I would argue can't, do that under most conditions, whereas nonviolence can. What nonviolence can also do is to minimize the often disastrous consequences of our limitations of knowledge, as attested earlier by the chronic incapacity of government leaders to judge accurately the outcomes of military ventures. Gandhi, again, is instructive here. Speaking of satyagraha, he said that it excludes the use of violence because man is not capable of knowing the absolute truth, and therefore not competent to punish. Now, whatever one's views on the ethics of nonviolence and whether or not one accepts Gandhi's conclusion, his premise that we're not capable of knowing the absolute truth is uncontroversial. If wisdom, whether in the personal or the social sphere, requires knowing thyself, then our limitations in knowledge must be reckoned in every undertaking that pits us against others or that risks harm or injury to others. This must always be a consideration that moderates patriotism and nationalism of any sort. Because there is and can be no consistently justifiable certainty about the consequences of our actions and policies, when those consequences involve the actions of others, both independently and in response to our actions, our social and political security orientation must reflect that fact. Nonviolence does this. If you're mistaken in your evaluation of a situation, you're in a position to learn and correct that mistake without the infliction of harm and suffering upon others. If you're mistaken in your predictions of the consequences of the use of force and violence, as I've argued world leaders are wrong almost precisely half the time, you may have rained death and destruction upon thousands of people as a result, leaving a residue of bitterness and resentment, possibly for generations, even by standard criteria, you've been successful. Recently, when the United States launched an attack on Sudan, a pharmaceutical plant that the U.S. Alleged was producing chemical weapons, all of the evidence that was produced afterwards indicates that they were simply mistaken about that. So even in 1998, there's a great capacity, even with so-called smart bombs and smart weapons and so forth, to make just enormous mistakes. Now, I've suggested that if we're to take seriously embarking upon a millennium of nonviolence, we must be prepared to rethink some of our most deeply established ways of thinking about our place in the world and our ways of relating to other human beings, both in our own societies and in distant lands. And in particular, we must be prepared to reconsider whether the dominant categories of the 20th century are the ones we want to govern our thought in the 21st century. Here I mention in particular the so-called realism, our long-established ways of valuing the interests, well-being, and survival of collectivities over that of living, breathing individual persons. Our attachment to the values of power, autonomy, and prestige are ingrained in that perspective, and our willingness hitherto to allow our options to be defined by the constraints contained within this perspective. If we're not prepared to do this, that is, to rethink and reconceptualize things, then perhaps it would be better, at least it would be less hypocritical, if we didn't even pay lip service to nonviolence. Now, is this worth doing, this rethinking? I'm convinced that it is, but I can only invite you to consider for yourselves whether or not this may be true. But I would add to what I've said that as part of the reconceptualization of our ways of thinking about the social and international world, we enlarge our perspective historically as well. If in contemplating a nonviolent world, we seek some grand scheme that will overnight resolve all of the world's problems and enable all peoples to live happily ever after, we'll be deluding ourselves. There is no such scheme, other perhaps than in the imagination of hopeless idealists. A nonviolent world will have to be created, and it will take time to do that. There will be disappointments and mistakes as we make our way and as we learn. We must discipline ourselves to look at the long term. Those of us in this room can't overnight change the entire world. But what we do or fail to do can play some small part in helping to determine what the world will be like 100, 500, or 1,000 years from now. For that world, whatever it is, will be the result of the countless actions over the years and over the centuries, not so much by the Gandhis and kings of the world, though they're an inspiration and help pave the way, as by ordinary people doing what they can do given their particular abilities and talents in the particular circumstances in which they find themselves. Such efforts may not individually be easily quantifiable, but cumulatively they can transform the world. We can, each of us, here and now, help in small ways to create a very different world for our children, and their children in turn, and the countless generations that will follow. And while I've urged that we wean ourselves from the collectivities of nation and state in favor of a respect for individual persons, in the end, the course to which this points is one in which our individual interests are ultimately transcended by a regard for the larger realm of beings inclusive of those who follow us. Though I haven't argued this, I would hope that a more expansive regard would include non-human animals and perhaps the environment and natural world itself. Is this too much for people to contemplate? Not at all. It may be too much for some people whose imaginations and intellects ossified long ago, but those people will eventually die off. But it's not too much for children. They can learn nonviolence, they can learn respect and compassion, and the humanistic use of science and technology. But it's up to us to reorient our whole conception of education to teach at the earliest levels and throughout the educational process the values of respect, caring, and compassion that we now honor only in passing so far as our collective lives are concerned. One of the most hopeful aspects of our present situation is that humankind is constantly in a process of renewal. And as it renews itself with each new generation of children, new possibilities come into existence. And it's up to us to see that we make use of those possibilities and not continue to follow the most important of them, to let the most important of them endlessly slip through our fingers. Now, Nehru said in 1947 that at the dawn of history, India started on her unending quest, and trackless centuries are filled with her striving in the grandeur of her successes and failures. Through good and evil fortune alike, she has never lost sight of that quest or forgotten the ideals which gave her strength. Among those ideals, I would suggest, perhaps none is higher historically than that of nonviolence, and no personal witness more inspiring than that of Gandhi in the 20th century. Of particular relevance to India's current world position, Gandhi stressed that nonviolence is for the strong, that so long as it's embraced out of weakness, it won't long succeed. He cited in particular the work of Bacha Khan. And incidentally, interesting to note that on this very date, November 14th in 1969, Bacha Khan was present at the opening ceremony of this university. Gandhi cites the work of Bacha Khan in transforming the tribesmen of the frontier province, who were fearless and warlike and well-schooled in the use of violence, into a non-violent army, and Gandhi expressed concern, that much of the non-violence among his followers was from weakness, that much of that non-violence withered after his death may tend to confirm his fear. But India, the land that gave birth to the very idea of nonviolence, has also proven, for better or worse, and there's sharp disagreement over this, that it can, if it chooses, compete with the nuclear powers of the world and can aspire to the same sort of role they've defined for themselves on the world scene. But India could also, if it chooses, step into a position of moral leadership by leading the way in the 21st century and turning the world toward nonviolence. This it can do from a position of strength of the sort the world understands. Gandhi observed in 1946 that India, and I quote, has become a pattern for all exploited races of the earth because it struggled for freedom nonviolently. Having been a model for the weak and oppressed of the world, India can now, if it chooses, become a model for the powerful as well. In so doing, it can give active, living embodiment to the Gandhian vision. As though anticipating this moment in India's history, Gandhi, when asked in the closing weeks of World War II whether he would go to the West to teach them the art of peace, he replied, "I know Europe and America. If I go there, I shall be like a stranger. Probably I shall be lionized, but that is all. I shall not be able to present to them the science of peace in language they can understand." But then he continued, "But they will understand if I can make good my nonviolence in India. I shall then speak through India." We can, all of us, individually give voice to Gandhi and the reality to his vision through our actions. But India is uniquely positioned to do that as a country. No country, certainly none of the nuclear powers, has contributed so much to fostering of nonviolence, both in theory and in practice. Already the light of Asia, if I may adapt Edward Arnold's expression, in its history and culture, India could be the light of the world in the 21st century by leading the way toward a millennium of nonviolence. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Holmes, for the inaugural lectures. Now I request, that our music club, they can give a small memento to our chief guest and Robert Holmes. I think people are anxiously waiting that what, that. So today, I think that we're talking about non-violence. No, it's a fear, it's a Buddha and Ahimsa, non-violence. I think that is exactly the right message. Now I request Professor Khan to give the vote of thanks. Madam Sonia Gandhi, Professor Robert Hall, Mr. Vice Chancellor, distinguished guests, my colleagues, students and friends. It is indeed a great honor to be asked to propose a vote of thanks on this important occasion. I would say a historic occasion for the university. The university, as Madam Gandhi herself reminded us, originated with the concept of peace and promotion of better understanding amongst nations, individuals, and societies. This vision of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was carried out in the form of several centers of study, programs of research and teaching in this university. We have, as the Vice Chancellor rightly said, we have consistent help from the Jawaharlal Nehru family, and for which I express my deep and profound thanks. I also wish to take this occasion to express my personal gratification at the mention of the Indian School of International Studies by Madame Gandhi, which was the precursor of this university and which was a favorite haunt for Panditji. I remember as a student seeing Panditji quite a few times coming over to Sapru House, the then Indian School of International Studies, which had become some kind of a center for intellectual activity and for the promotion of foreign policy of India. I am most grateful to you, Madam, for sparing your time, especially on an occasion like this when you are so busy with the other national matters and issues. And I am most grateful to all those who have helped in organizing this function and in making it a success. Thank you very much. Right now, the national anthem is
maybe all of you join us for a cup of tea in the backyard.
Just one question. One question.
what they're getting some.
No, you mentioned.